Claxby Hill. We had a very long, we-made Norwegian-style sledging.
No, not that.
We hurtled down, we hit what not to be disturbed.
Go and find her. Where are you going, Master?
For a drink.
Hey everybody, my name is Alex. I make up 1/4 of a Doctor and a Lawyer Walk Into a Bar podcast. Our show is very straightforward. 4 friends talking about the various interests in our lives, where we gather in a fictional pub. Our show has been a great learning ground. It's taught us how to make a show from the ground up. And I want to share my editing with you. What do I do from a philosophical standpoint in how to edit a podcast? And then I want to talk about how I edit a podcast actually. So let's dive in. Today, I'm going to break down a few simple things. What we use to edit, process for processing our audio before we start, and the basics of preparing the audio. So first things first, the way we record our audio is a website called Riverside. Riverside is our choice because we have to record over the internet, given the geographical distance between the 4 of us. What it does is allows us to record high quality audio over the internet and still have video conferencing. We use Riverside in place of something like Skype or Teams or Zoom, and that's because the audio quality is much, much higher. Each of our audio tracks are recorded locally on our individual browsers and then uploaded as we record, so that we're not worrying about that internet vocal processing. So it does save us a lot of time, a lot of headaches, and gives us better quality audio, as opposed to each of us recording our tracks in a voice memo while also being on Zoom, then trying to upload that to a shared drive and then pull that back down and sync them. Riverside does all of that for us. Highly, highly, highly recommend that for the recording process. So that's the background and how we record, but what do we do with that audio once we have it? So what I'm going to do is I'm starting here in our editor. We use a digital audio workstation, a DAW. Now, there are several different online audio solutions. There's Audacity, there's Logic, there's GarageBand. Why did we pick Reaper? Well, Reaper is designed to be the best of both worlds. It has wonderful functionality. It's actually used by quite a few radio production companies, but it's also very, very affordable. So while it may not be as powerful as something like Logic or Adobe Audition, it's also $60 at the time of recording, and that is a perpetual license, including updates. So you buy it once, you get updates, and it has almost all the functionality of the big dogs. Now, I wanted to open up Reaper from scratch. None of my templates are built out. Nothing is in here yet. This is the setup that you would get the first time you open Reaper. So let me show you some of the things that I will initially do. The first thing I do is I'm going to right click up here on the timeline. It's initially set for minutes and beats, and that's because most audio production is actually geared towards music, which uses measures and beats, but we are an audio medium for a podcast, which primarily deals in minutes and seconds. So I switch that to minutes and seconds. The other thing that you'll see is these grid lines. I want to turn the grid lines off. So I'm going to deselect that. And what this does for me is as I go to edit and move audio around, it won't snap into place. Now that we've gotten a few of the basic housekeeping up to date, I'm going to show you how I set up the audio tracks. Here's what I'll do. I'm going to insert a new track. I'm going to do this a couple times. One for each of us, and we're going to create one more. So I'm going to call this top vocals. I'm going to call this one William. I'm going to call this one Cody. This one I'm going to call Dallas. And this last one will be Alex. Now I have all 4 of these tracks selected. I'm going to drag them up into this first track. What this will do is create a folder. So all of these tracks fall within the vocals folder. This is useful for a couple reasons. One being that this top folder track, the vocals track, will start showing the waveform for all of the underlying tracks. So as the tracks start getting built on top of each other, I can see one combined waveform for all of the below tracks. And that's great because as I edit, I can start finding individual moments of silence, which is either a gap in the sync where the tracks aren't lined up properly, or just a gap in silence, which I'll want to remove for pacing purposes. The other major reason to create a folder system is that even after I do vocal processing on each of these underlying tracks, I can add processing to the folder as a whole. So once I get all of our voices together, I may add a compressor to all of them at once. So here's what I want to do. I want to create a few more tracks, and I'm going to pull this out and have it be its own thing. I'm going to call this the music. And let's create another one underneath that. 2 more here, and I'll show you why. We're going to take both of these, put them in the music folder now, and let's call this intro and outros. And we will call this one effects. And then let's go ahead and I like to, out of personal preference, I like to take the music, put it at the very top. Why? Personal preference. Now we have each of our tracks set up. I can start dragging in our downloaded content. So I'm going to go into my downloads from Reaper, and I have all of our tracks recorded here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull in all these WAV files. I'm going to set them up as close to possible. Now I've gotten all of our audio loaded into Reaper. What I'm going to do is start vocal processing. So if you look at these audio tracks, you can see that William has some very high peaks and some very low lows. Cody is very low across the board, and this is part of recording a podcast. Some weeks your mic is just a little too sensitive. You've got your gain set too high. Other weeks it's a little too low. So we need to normalize the audio. What normalizing will help us do is help us avoid that pitfall of other podcasts or radio shows where one host is very, very loud and the other host is very, very quiet. And you feel like you're having to jockey the volume knob up and down to match the loudness of each of the hosts. So this is going to get us into a very, very specific conversation very early on in editing, and that is about normalization. How do we want to normalize the audio across these 4 speakers and multiple tracks? Now, we're all familiar with a decibel level. A decibel level is how loud something is in terms of the signal. But we need to think of another standard, which is how we perceive loudness. For instance, a jazz track could be the same decibel value as a dubstep track, but the dubstep track will sound louder to us because of constant peaks. So a standard called LUFS was created. In fact, it was developed for television commercials and has been adopted by most major players, including Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, and all of the other distributors. And what this does is helps them normalize tracks across the board. So as you listen to one track next to another track, it should sound the same. Now, each distributor has their own specific LUFS level that they prefer. A safe bet is right around -14 LUFS. Now, what does that all mean? Well, one, it means that you want to try and master your track as close to the distributors as possible. You'd like them to not have to fiddle with your audio too much. If you can land right in the middle of all the distributors, you're probably safe. If you're too loud, they're just going to turn you back down. And if you're too quiet, they will turn it back up. If you're already very close, you avoid a lot of headache when you send it to these distributors like Spotify, Apple, and iHeartRadio. The other thing that I mentioned is Luft's I. And what is Luft's I? Well, it's Luft's integrated. There are a few different ways that you can measure the loudness, but what they do is they can look at very momentary sections of loudness. And then they look at sections of the peaks. Then we can say, what's the average of those two measurements of loudness? And that's Luft's I, integrated. And so we don't want to just normalize everything to the loudest point all the time. And we don't want to do it just to a momentary individual point. We want to find that average. What I'm going to do, you see I have William's track here. I'm going to solo that. I hit this S button right here, the solo button. I'm going to select both of his tracks right now and go to Actions. Now, I have already built a shortcut for this normalization, but you can search Normalize Items, and this one right here that has Peak, RMS, and LUFS. That's the one we want to select. So we're going to run this, and I have added a shortcut. So from any other time forward, I will be using this shortcut, but I'm going to show you what this does. When you hit run, it will pull up this little dialog that says normalize to, and you can select LUFS, RMS, Peak, True Peak, LUFS M Max, LUFS S Max. You can pick a few different things. Now, I think that we should be right around -14 LUFS. And we're going to select normalize items together to that common gain. So we want to try and have these two tracks be the same. So let's hit OK. Beautiful. Now you noticed, let's do a little before and after. So this is after, before, after, before, after. Pretty impressive, right? That is normalizing everything. But I don't want just William normalized to that level. I want everyone normalized to that level. So let's go ahead, select everyone, hit our shortcut for normalization again, and now we're going to have everyone to a common gain. So what this is doing is it's making sure that all four of us hosts have a same loudness across each of our tracks. So here's the finished result. You can see in this one, I do a lot of narrating. I promise I don't talk this much all the time. Well, my wife will disagree. I do talk a lot. So now all of our tracks should be an equal loudness. So this is great because it's going to solve us the problem of having to turn up the volume, turn down the volume, turn up the volume, turn down the volume. It's a quality of life process for our listener. Now that we have normalized our audio, let's start vocal processing. Now, I have already created vocal effects chains. What is that? Well, it's when you pull in a whole list of effects and then save them as one preset. I am going to start from scratch for you all to show you how I process vocals. All right, let's start with William for a moment. We're going to solo his track. So how I start processing him. Let's hit the effects. Now you can see I already have my chain built out. I'm going to show you what effects I use. So the first thing that I want to do, this is just a quality of life thing. I'm going to pull in a loudness meter. And this is going to start looking at the loudness of just a section of this track, right? So we have done no processing except to begin normalizing. And I have no idea how loud this is going to be. So let's find out, shall we?
Record a sound and then like tone it down, but it would also slow it down. And so naturally, we're in med school. We were desperately seeking any sort of levity. We all got the fizziest drinks we could and would belch into the iPad.
Pretty good story, but we can see a few problems so far. One, even though our LUFS I is hitting a pretty good spot, and his LRA, this is the average between the loudness. This is LUFS M momentary and LUFS S sustained. These are good, but what we don't like is how it's peaking and it's clipping. So now that we have this loudness meter, we know some of the things we need to target. Williams Audio is reaching a max level of 4.5 decibels. We want to target closer to negative 18 decibels. That's really where we want to be. I'm going to pull in a new effect. We're going to pull in RIA Limit. And this is a limiter. It works similar to a compressor in that what it's doing is we're setting a threshold for how loud we are willing to let audio go before we want to start bringing it back down. So I think that if we're going to start hitting a threshold, let's see here, true peak, we want to have low latency. These are just things that okay, so we want to hit negative 18 decibels as kind of our goal. So anything that goes over that, we need to pull back down. So let's pull this in. What this is going to start doing is pulling the peaks together. So let's see here. So what did I just do? I created a threshold. I said if anything goes above this level, negative 24 decibels, then we need to start pulling those peaks down. So what's happening here? Why did we use a limiter? What is this doing? Well, what this is doing is helping us pull down these peaks right here. And so we're going to watch it 2 times through. We're going to watch it A, from the limiter's perspective, and B, from the loudness meter's perspective.
And you could record a sound and then like tone it down, but it would also slow it down. And so naturally, we're in med school. We were desperately seeking any sort of levity. We all got the fizziest drinks we could and would belch into the iPad and then slow it.
All right. So we can see right here that peaks are starting to get cut off and a limiter is kicking in. And this is showing us how we're trying to pull it back down. Our brick wall is saying we cannot go over this ceiling. This is the max drop dead point that we're allowing our audio to go. So let's watch it from the loudness meter's perspective again and see how this looks instead. And remember, before when we were listening to this audio, it was maxing out at plus 4.5 decibels. Let's see how it peaks this time.
And so naturally, we're in med school. We were desperately seeking any sort of levity. We all got the fizziest drinks we could and would belch into the iPad and then slow it down. Kristen's sounded like some sort of prehistoric beast.
So what we see here is that both our LUFS M for momentary, LUFS S for sustained, and our LUFS integrated I have all actually shifted upwards slightly because we're actually bringing that whole dynamic range together. And what is dynamic range? That is the difference between the quietest parts of where we talk and the loudest parts of where we talk. By bringing those together, it actually sounds a little bit louder over the sustained duration of our listening experience as a listener. And you see that the LRA, the average between these two, has actually decreased. So that's good and bad. We want to make sure that we are not sounding flat over a sustained amount of time, which, thanks to the dynamics of everything else, we shouldn't. But we also have made sure that it's a pleasant listening experience. So I think we're going to be good for right now. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to all plugins. We are going to look for Refer. And Refer is a dynamics processor. What does that mean? In fancy speak, it means that it's going to be listening to individual frequency ranges and helping us process those individually. So why is this beneficial, I hear you ask? That's because we can look at sections of what appear to be silence and train this for individual frequencies that are causing noise in our audio. So you heard William speaking there. There was a little bit of a hum, either from the refrigerator or air conditioner, maybe a light, and we are going to be able to eliminate that audio entirely. So what I've done is I've clicked on this section of audio right here. I'm going to take this and I am going to loop it. You can see that this is selected to loop right here. And now we're going to make some changes in Refer. The first thing we're going to do is we are going to set this mode to subtract. That means that it's going to start creating a gate for us and saying any audio that is within these frequencies, we're going to help eliminate. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to make this precise. Instead of being individual points, it is now looking for precise frequencies that are giving us problems. And I have found that either the 1024 or the 2048 FFT size is best for identifying the audio problem areas. If you get too specific and too granular, like up here, it sounds a little computer garbly. And if you go too low, you also run into the same problem because now it's such broad, sweeping points that you're not actually pinpointing precisely the areas that are giving us problems. Let's watch this yellow bar that will appear down here when I press play. Oof, that is all noise in William's recording. So we are going to hit this button right here, automatically build noise profile. You just saw it build a profile, but I would caution you to be selective about which section you use to train this model. And for an example, I'm going to back it up right here. A lot of these frequencies that I'm highlighting right here, that 1000 on hertz range, those are human noises a lot of times. So let's listen to this section right here, and you can hear William breathe. So I've very selectively curated this section right here. There's no breathing. I don't hear my own vocals coming out of William's headphones and being picked up by his microphone. I've got this selected right here. I'm going to turn the effect back on and have it automatically rebuild the selection based off this section of background noise. Now it is much more specific, much more accurate to just that hum of the refrigerator. So I'm going to give it a few seconds to build as accurately as possible, and then I'm going to hit stop. I'm going to deselect automatically build noise profile, because if I keep that on, it will start picking up the frequencies of William's speech and then cancel out all noise, including his speech. So let's deselect that. And now let's go over to the same section where William was starting to tell us his story and listen, because we may need to either raise this noise gate or lower the noise gate if it's too aggressive.
First got an iPad, we had a garage band, and you could record a sound and then like tone it down, but it would also slow it down. And so naturally, we're in med school, we were desperately seeking, but it would also slow it down. And so we all got to fit, but it would also slow it down.
So I think what I can do is actually lower this noise gate ever so slightly. The biggest problem points are actually in this range right here, from about 600 hertz back. That's where a lot of the noise is living. And so we can actually lower this whole noise gate down. Now I'm going to show you what happens if it's too high. You're going to hear what sounds like that classic Zoom noise cancellation sound. You ready?
And so naturally, we're in med school, we were desperately seeking any sort of levity.
Ugh, it just sounds like that computer generated noise reduction. Let's take this noise gate and lower it, like I mentioned. All right, that is probably where it needs to be.
And so naturally, we're in med school, we were desperately seeking any sort of levity. We all got to fit, but it would also slow it down. And so
I think right here is the sweet spot. It doesn't quite sound like a computer-generated effect. It sounds very clean, and it doesn't have that annoying refrigerator hum in it at all. The next effect that I want to add is an equalizer. So we're going to look for Re-EQ. The way the equalizer is used is to help us more finely process vocals. So we are going to start getting these nice tones out of our voices and make them sound smoother. So the first thing we want to do is from this first marker, we can actually create just a nice curve that eliminates pretty much anything from 100 hertz down. This is the frequencies that are very low rumbles that are almost subhuman, that you don't really quite hear. That's where that refrigerator hum is, or AC, or a lot of times it's frequencies coming in from the microphone from either our electric sources or an XLR cable. We can actually help remove that by just turning down the gain over here. It will not affect the vocals, and it helps clean it up ever so slightly. So we are going to look at this section and just lower the gain. And you'll notice that after I reach a certain point, it will create a curve for us. Right now, it just looks like it's going to keep lowering indefinitely. And around 40 decibels, negative 40 decibels, it's just going to create a curve. And point, there it goes. So it just created a curve for us. Basically, I turn it down to infinity. The next thing that I want to target is the tones that sound like you're talking through a tube. I want to eliminate that at all cost. So what I'm going to do is take a frequency and raise the gain so that it's easy to identify, and we are going to lower the bandwidth. And this is making a very fine-tuning selection. And what we will do is start this back around the 200 hertz range and start playing the audio while we pan the frequency across to try and identify those frequencies that sound very harsh, very tinny, and we will then lower the gain to eliminate them almost entirely. So let's listen to this section as we move the frequency across the hertz range, and let's find those horrible sounding areas of our vocals.
Naturally, we're in med school. We were desperately seeking any sort of levity. We all got the fizziest drinks we could and would belch. When we first got an iPad, we had a garage band, and you could record a sound and then like tone it down, but it would also slow it down.
Right here around the 470 hertz range for William in particular, this is what sounds probably the harshest for him. So I'm going to slightly open up this bandwidth a little bit, and we are going to gently lower the gain right around 3.5 to 4 decibels. Okay, so this is going to help flatten out those vocals, eliminate those harsh tones, and get rid of background noise. The third thing I like to do in an equalizer is actually boost a little of this bass section ever so slightly, because we've eliminated some of these harsh midtones. Let's bring some of the bass back ever so slightly, raise it again. So let's pull this up just a hair, not even 2 decibels up, and I'm actually going to even lower the bandwidth so that it's just a very small selection. This next part is personal preference. Anything beyond about 2,000 hertz up into this 20,000 hertz range, that is where a lot of the intricacies of our human voices live. Now, when you watch us speak, you see this section light up. I don't personally like adding any gain to this section because it winds up distorting the audio ever so slightly. That is personal preference. I have seen many vocal editors slightly raise a curve from about this 5,000 to 6,000 hertz range and create a slight curve upward. That is not my personal preference. I have done it before, depending on the audio, but it is up to you as the editor to listen and hear what sounds best. Let's listen to this section of William talking again with the equalizer and without, and let's see if you can tell the difference. You ready?
An iPad, we had a garage band, and you could record a sound and then like tone it down, but it would also slow it down. And so naturally, we're in med school. We were desperately seeking any sort of levity. We all got the fizziest drinks we could and would belch. When we first got an iPad, we had a garage band, and you could record a sound and then like
See how much smoother his voice sounds with the equalizer? That is the main reason that I like using this. The other thing I want to talk about is how you want to put these in order. Generally, anytime I'm boosting audio, changing audio levels, that should come after some of the vocal processing, such as an equalizer or the noise gate. I want to do that because when we slightly boosted the bass and lowered the midtones, that's going to change that threshold just a touch. So I've reset both of those peaks where it was peaking too high for my level at over 0 decibels. Now that we've moved the equalizer up in the chain, let's watch how it winds up changing where the limiter starts hitting.
When we first got an iPad, we had a GarageBand, and you could record a sound and then like tone it down.
Perfect. Right back at that negative 5.9. That's what we're looking for. So far, we have added an equalizer, a noise gate, and a limiter. The other thing I like to add is this transient controller. This is going to help me get rid of some of those harsh S sounds, the sibilants. And so what we can do is just lower the sustain, meaning how quickly do we roll back some of those harsh sounds. And so just by rolling the sustain back to about negative 40%, a lot of those sharp S sounds and echoes will start being eliminated. This is not an exact science. I can't give you an exact number for the sustain. You're going to have to listen to your own audio and determine what individual track needs what percent sustain lowered. I personally like a lower sustain to remove some of that sharpness on S's. You may find that you like a little more echoey room tone. That is personal preference. This is what we do. And the last thing that I add is RIA comp. This is a compressor, very much like a limiter. This is taking your audio and helping lower the dynamic range. We set a threshold again. I found that around negative 24 is a good place to start having this kick in. That means that we're trying to hit that negative 18 decibel mark when we export this. And now we are going to tell the computer that anytime audio exceeds this threshold, we need to start lowering it. But we want to do that at a ratio. So for every 4 decibels that it exceeds this negative 24, 1 decibel will come back. The knee size is your wiggle room. How quickly, how aggressively is this kicking in? Is it within 0 decibels? It's immediately starting? Or do you want to give it some wiggle room? I like giving it about a 2 decibel variance, a knee between when it starts hitting with its full force, and that allows that dynamic range in the audio. So let's listen to this with no effects on.
First got an iPad, we had a GarageBand, and you could record a sound and then like tone it down, but it would also slow it down. And so naturally, we're in med school. We were desperately seeking any sort of levity. We all got the fizziest drinks we could and would belch.
Wow. Okay, so with nothing on this audio, we have already peaked at positive 4 decibels. That is way too loud. We have had a LUFS M, a momentary, a max of negative 9, a LUFS S, the sustain, at negative 13, which gave us a LUFS I, an integrated, of negative 15. All right, let's break all of these numbers down to layman's terms. We want to try and target negative 18 decibels for mastering. So positive 4 decibels is way too loud. It's going to start clipping our audio, sounding garbled. We don't want that. Negative 9.6 decibels on the LUFS momentary is also very, very loud. We're going to perceive that as incredibly loud. And a LUFS sustained at negative 13.4, which means that the dynamic range between the two of those is almost a full 5 decibels. That's an extreme difference when you're trying to listen to someone tell stories. And then your left's eye is actually at a respectable negative 15. But it doesn't sound very good. I'm going to subject you to this one more loop. Let's hear how bad it sounds, and then we're going to turn everything back on. You ready?
We're desperately seeking any sort of levity. We all got the fizziest drinks we could and would belch. When we first got an iPad, we had the...
Ooh. All right, here we go.
Naturally, we're in med school. We were desperately seeking any sort of levity. We all got the fizziest drinks we could and would belch. When we first got an iPad, we had the GarageBand, and you could record a sound and then like tone it down. But it...
Wow. Okay. So what did we just discover? Well, we were peaking at negative 7 decibels, which is very good. Our LUFS M, the momentary, was negative 19 decibels, which is great. And the sustained was negative 22. Also very good, which means that we had a dynamic range of just about 1 decibel, which is so much smoother for listening to. The last thing that I want to do is do a little bit of the fine tuning. I noticed that the threshold for the compressor was a little too low, so I've raised that back up, and I've also lowered my ratio a little bit, closer to 3-to-1. And the wet mix means that I'm actually outputting at a slightly higher decibel range. I've also made a slight change to our limiter. I've raised our threshold and lowered our brick wall. Let's give it one last listen through and see what we think. Let's reset all of these peaks.
An iPad, we had the GarageBand, and you could record a sound and then like tone it down, but it would also slow it down. And so naturally, we're in med school. We were desperately seeking any sort of levity. We all got the fizziest drinks we could and would belch.
You heard how much smoother that sounded, how much better, how much pleasanter. Pleasanter. That's a word now if it isn't already. It is to the ear as you're listening to that. If you're going to listen to a podcast, which is any length of time over just a couple minutes, you want to make sure that it's easy for your listener to listen to. Otherwise, they're going to turn it off and walk away. Now that I've created this effects chain right here, I'm going to save that. Okay? So I'm going to call this podcast vocals. It already exists, just showing you. We'll replace it, same difference. And here we have our new chain for podcast vocals. One note to make. When you load this chain for each of your hosts, you will need to toy around with 2 sections. The first being where that tinny sound is, and the second in particular will be the noise gate that we're creating. That profile will be different based on everyone's recording. So you will have to tweak each of these settings individually for each track. But now that you have this effect chain created, it'll take you far less time and it will be much, much quicker to start editing. So we have learned how to create vocal effects chains. That way you can automatically create these effects the second you walk in. The third and final step that I do in preparing my audio for the full edit is called an auto trim split. Now the auto trim split is looking for areas of silence and removing them. And what this does, it actually serves 2 functions for us simultaneously. One, noise is cumulative, so it doesn't matter how good of a job we've done at removing noise with reefer, it's never going to be perfect. So if we can remove areas that appear silent but may contain noise, we're actually lowering the overall noise signal. The way to think about it is as if we had a noise machine, a white noise machine that you use to go to sleep. If you turn that down to the lowest setting, it may not sound like much noise at all. But if you had 4 of those noise machines, the effect would be cumulative and you would hear it as much louder than one individual noise machine at the lowest setting. That is the same effect that happens here. Even though we have 4 vocal tracks and we've turned down the noise as much as possible using reefer, there is still some latent noise in that signal, and if we can remove those areas of silence as much as possible, we are going to lower the overall noise. That is the first function of the auto trim split. The second function is ease of editing. It actually allows us to move each of these audio snippets individually, helps us remove areas faster, and helps us with the overall editing process. So we're going to learn how to run an auto trim split. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of our tracks right here. Then I'm going to go up to the Actions drop down, Show Action List, and we're going to search for Auto Trim Split. There it is. I have a shortcut for this already. I recommend you set up one as well. And we are going to hit the Run button, and this is going to pull up an action menu for us. Now, what we're looking at here is a whole bunch of figures that you can start fiddling with to your liking. The concept is very straightforward. Again, it's dealing with thresholds. So if there is a sound that is louder than -30 decibels, we are assuming that a human intended to make that sound, and we want to save that in the final edit. If something is quieter than that -30 threshold, then we can assume that it was either an accidental noise or not fit for human ears. You can fiddle with these other parameters. I've set them to my liking. I have found that if we ignore silence that's less than 100 milliseconds, that if we make non-silent clips no shorter than 100 milliseconds, and have a pad on either end of 100 milliseconds, what we're able to do is preserve any of those small chortles or chuckles, and we still avoid a lot of breaths, things that we just don't want to hear. There are two settings that I highly encourage you to leave set. Unless you're a one-man show, in which case you want all of your audio to snap together, you should keep the preserve timing of non-silent areas checked. This will delete the silence and leave your talking sections in their place. If you are your own host and a one-man show, in theory, you could deselect this option and snap all of your audio together. It may cause for some awkwardness in the pacing of your dialogue, so I would still encourage leaving it checked. And the last thing is the run signal through track effects for detection. Remember how we just went through and added a limiter, we changed the compressor, all of those things that we did to our audio, the nice things to make it sound as crisp and as clear and as pleasant as possible. What this will do is run through the effects first for any changes, and then make the selection of silence based on the effects that are on the audio. I recommend leaving these two settings checked for the easiest use. The other note that I will make is that sometimes on a first pass it does not work perfectly. If you notice, we have about 6 cumulative hours of audio here. Sometimes you have to select a track for whatever reason that just didn't get run. It's not a problem, don't worry, just reselect a track and hit run again. Through the power of editing, let's see how long this took. Alright, and just like that, in 6 minutes time elapsed, we have processed 6 hours of audio and removed all silence from all 4 individual speakers' tracks. So that is how I process the audio before I even begin the deeper edit. I showed you how to set up the timeline to make sure that it's in minutes and seconds. I showed you how to remove the grid and make sure that that's not showing as we begin the edit process. I've shown you how to set up folders with individual tracks for processing. I've showed you how to normalize audio. I've shown you how I process audio to get the best sounding audio from each of your hosts. And finally, I've shown you how to run an auto trim split to make your editing process even simpler. In the next episode, I'm going to cover a few different topics. The first being the philosophy of how to edit. In that, I'm going to cover what stays in a podcast, what I remove and what I move around, and why I do that. And I'm also going to show you how to actually edit the podcast. In that, I mean how to make deletions, how to move tracks and sync audio appropriately, and how to add your intros, outros, music, and effects. So I hope this series has been helpful so far. I'm looking forward to having you on the next one. Again, I've been Alex with A Doctor and a Lawyer, and if you like what you hear here, I hope you come swing by the podcast. Subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks again.
One snapped in two, which was I.